Hey there, beer brewers and beer drinkers. I'm Dave, and today I'm going to brew for you an Oatmeal Chocolate Stout. It's mid-October, the days are getting shorter, and the weather's getting colder. Perfect time to brew a dark beer. I've brewed this one before, a slight variation. This one is a little bit different, so like I do always, I'm going to take you through the entire step of the way, from the very beginning of the boil all the way through to the tasting and review of how it turned out. So what I'm doing here is I'm boiling or bringing up 4 gallons of water here in my kettle up to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I'm going to begin my mash. So I'll take you through every step of the way, and I promise that I will do my best to limit my talking. I looked at my last video and I did quite a bit of it, so it kind of dragged it out too long. So I'm going to be short and sweet to the point, and hopefully you'll get enough information to be able to brew this one yourself. This is going to be an all-grain beer like I've done before, so a lot of the steps that you'll see are very similar to what I've done before. So stay tuned and we'll get right back together once I begin my mash. See you in a bit. Okay, so I'm at the step now where I've brought my water up to 170 degrees and I put it into my mash here, and now I'm adding all my grains. So I've started to do that, and this is the final part of it. This is kind of what it looks like when it's all ground up. You'll have to have this done at your brew shop when you go get all your ingredients, but I'll share with you the recipe as to what I'm putting in here and the proportions of each. But this is the final part. I'm going to dump the rest of this in here. Like I mentioned before, it's important to get your stirring stick and mix this in. You don't want any air pockets to form because you got a lot of grains in here. I'm going to let that water get in there so you have a good conversion here and have this thing work like you want it. So I put it all in here. It's going to sit in here. It should have brought this temperature down to about 150 degrees. It's going to need to stay in here for about 100 minutes at that temperature. And then after that, we'll do our sparging. But in a moment here, I'm going to share with you the recipe that I'm using so you can do this yourself. So give me a second here. What do you think, Murphy? Good? Alright, Murphy's keeping me company today. So I'll be right back with the recipe. Alright, here's the recipe that I'm using for this chocolate oatmeal stout. Again, I'm doing all grain. So you can see here I have about a little over 11 pounds worth of grain. Sorry about that. So here's what I had just put in there. About 8.5 pounds of the Pilsner 2-row. I got some rolled oats in there. The crystal used to be 75. They didn't have that, so I subbed it out with 80. Hopefully that will work all right. And as you can read here, all the other things that I have in there as well. Okay. Down here for my hops, it also shows the time that I put them in to my boil. I'm using Simcoe for this one. It specifies their leaf. Now, I've used pellets before, but this go around when I went to my brew shop, they only had leaf. And as a matter of fact, they only had 2-ounce bags left. Apparently there's a significant shortage in hops these days, specifically with this particular kind. I don't know if it's affecting others, but I lucked out and got 2 bags of Simcoe hops for this, so I'm covered for that, thank goodness, because otherwise I'd probably have to sub it out with something else. One thing I had to sub out with as well here is the yeast. It calls for American Ale. That wasn't available. The closest I could get was California Ale. It's White Labs brand WLP 001 for your reference there. And other miscellaneous ingredients. Here it calls for cocoa nibs. Now, you're probably asking what the heck is a cocoa nib? I didn't know either. I looked it up, but basically it is this. It's just a cacao bean that has been roasted, shelled, and prepared up until the point to where it's going to be, I guess, crushed down into pure cacao, which is just the unsweetened, just raw coconut bean, I guess, if you will. So I didn't have this either, and I couldn't find it anywhere. My shop didn't have it, and I couldn't find it anywhere around. So what I'm doing is replacing it with some 100% cacao unsweetened chocolate. So it's as close as I could get. The cacao is actually more of a nuttier flavor. It's used. It's very popular these days, apparently, in baking. So I'm subbing this out, which is, I don't know, hopefully not a huge departure from what this is calling for. It's only calling for an ounce, so I guess I'll be okay. I'm tempted to actually use more than an ounce because I really want this stout to have a good, rich, chocolatey feel to it. So I might roll the dice and bump it up and throw an extra ounce in there. Anyway, Irish moss, again, as always, I use it at the end. It's a clarifying agent, 1 teaspoon here. It's calling it the last 5 minutes of the boil. So once we get going here, we just started with our mash, and we'll pick it up where we start our sparging. So let me run down the list here for you again, in case you missed the first time. This is what's in my mash right now. Here are the hops that I'm using. The yeast. And the extra stuff. Now this is saying that it's going to be at about 7.5% alcohol by volume, which I didn't think it was going to be that high. So I'll take some measurements to see how well it does. It says it's 66 on the bitterness scale. That might be a little bit too bitter for this. I wanted to have more of a malty feel, but we'll see how it turns out. I think I'll be happy with it no matter how it goes. Anyway, there I go again talking. I'm going to shut up now and move on to the next step. We'll get there shortly. Bye. So we're now at the point where our grains have been in the mash here for 100 minutes, and now we're at the sparging process. So one of the first things you want to do when you do that is you want to recirculate your what's going to be your wort back through the system. Initially, when you do this, you're going to notice that there is a lot of sediment, a lot of husks that form on the bottom, and you don't want that. And I don't know if you can see in here, but there are some husks that are floating around in there. I don't know how clear that is, but anyway, you want to recirculate that back through the process again. And as you'll notice, it's very dark, which is fantastic. It's exactly what I want to achieve with this. It should be dark, which is exactly what I expected. So what I'm going to do now for a couple of these is just kind of circulate your hot liquor back through here, and then we'll begin our actual sparging process, and I'll show you what that looks like. It doesn't look like anything different than what I've done before, but what you're essentially doing at that point is just rinsing your grains. You want to get as much of the sweet wort out through the grain bed without disturbing it too much. So I'm going to continue to do this for a little bit, and we'll check back in when we begin the sparging. So I want to show you this. This is the sparging that I've begun doing. Up here I have just a cooler filled up with 170 Fahrenheit water. It's coming down a tube, and it's going through this little spray apparatus over the grain bed. And you can see how hot it is. It's just steaming, which is great. It's going to go through there and really rinse these grains well and get all the sweet wort out of there, which is being collected down here in my brew kettle. And you can see how dark it is. It looks fantastic. This is going to be hopefully turn out to be a really good beer. So I need to fill this up to a little over 5 gallons, which is just about, just maybe underneath this little ridge here. Because when I do my boil, I'm going to lose some due to evaporation, so I need to have a little bit more in there. So when I do my fermenting, I'll have enough all the way through to when I keg. So this is going to run for a little while, and we'll pick it up when I start boiling my wort, which is where I start adding my hops. So stay tuned. Hey, I just wanted to throw this out there. If you're brewing outdoors like I am, it's fall right now, it's mid-October, and I have a lot of pecan trees and just overhanging trees over my deck here. So you want to make sure that you kind of protect what you're doing here. You don't want any nuts or anything like that falling in there that you're not aware of, because that's probably going to throw off the flavors or cause some problems. So just be aware that if you're doing this outdoors, you cover things up just to make sure that nothing falls in there when your back's turned. So just a little tip. So anyway, we'll be back soon. So I've collected my sweet wort, and now my brew kettle here, I have about close to 6 gallons of wort that I'm now going to bring up to a boil. Once I get to a boiling point, my length of the boil is going to last for a duration of 100 minutes. Once it starts to boil, I need to wait approximately 10 minutes, and that's when I'm going to add my cocoa nibs, but in this case my cacao chocolate that I got. I'm going to add that 10 minutes into the boil, and then at about 40 minutes into the boil, when there's 60 minutes left, I'm going to add my first addition of hops, which is 1.5 ounces. I'll review this with you as we get along that way, but we're on our way now throughout our boil. I guess we're about halfway there, so we'll see how this thing turns out. It's very dark, which is really good. It kept that way. It stayed that the darkness was complete all the way through while I was sparging, so it's really looking like a good hearty stout. So I'm hoping that with the addition of the chocolate and when it all comes together, it's going to be a really good mouth-filling stout. So I'll keep you posted, but we'll check back in with you when we get to where this is starting to boil. Okay, so we finally reached our boiling point, and we've waited about 10 minutes now, so we're 10 minutes into the boil, and according to the recipe, that's where I'm to add my cocoa, which I have right here, 2 ounces, 1, 2. It calls for 1, but I'm going to add 2 just to see if I can boost up a little bit of the chocolate flavor in it, so we'll see how that goes. So there goes 1. And there goes 2. Now, the next step isn't until 60 minutes into the boil, which is a little bit from now. At that time, that's when I'm going to add my hops, my first addition of hops, which is going to be 1.5 ounces of the leaf. Now, I'm using a bag this time, and I'll show you what I'm using. I've never used leaf hops before, so the bag is going to contain the leaf or the hops flour, and so it doesn't get to the bottom. And when I go and do my filtering later, it doesn't clog up anything. So it's going to contain the hop flour, yet it's still going to enable it to release all of its flavor into my boil. So we've got a little bit of a time to wait right now, so I'm going to go grab myself a beer, and I'll see you back here in a little bit for our first hop addition. Okay, so we have 60 minutes left to our boil here, and this is the point where we add our first addition of hops. Now, like I said before, I had to get leaf hops this time, and I put them into this bag, the strainer bag, to contain the hop flour. And if you have never seen what like leaf hops look before in their raw form, this is what it looks like. Those that get pellets, you know, they come in those little pelletized nuggets, but this is what it looks like. They're very crunchy, so you definitely want to contain them. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of give this a little tie, a loose knot, because what I'm going to have to do is add an additional 1/2 ounce later on, and I want to be able to easily untie this. So I'm going to add this now. Now, if this works like I think it is, it's probably going to boil over, or try to. It usually has in the past. Just be aware when you add hops, you might get a boil over. You just got to control your heat. Just turn it down a little bit, and it should calm it down. It doesn't seem to be doing it so bad. You can't see it from your angle, but it's pretty calm. Anyway, that's the first hop addition. I have another one coming up. 10 minutes left of the boil, I think. Yeah, I have a half ounce coming in at 10 minutes left, and then shortly after that we'll add our Irish moss. But it's looking really good so far. Smells great. Smells like a stout, malty so far. Of course, now I'm adding hops, so it might add a little bit more of a hop aroma. Since this is the first edition, it's starting to boil over now. So anyway, we'll keep an eye on it, and I'll check back in with you during our next hop edition. Okay, so I had just added my last 1/2 ounce of Simcoe hops here, and that was at 10 minutes left in the boil. I started a little early because I wanted to get that bag open, because as you remember, I'm having leaf hops, so I wanted to get time to open that bag up and put the other 1/2 ounce in there. And For those doing it that way, I don't know if I would recommend it because the bag gets so hot that when you try and untie it, it takes a little bit of time for the cool down and to put the remaining hops back in the bag. So that was, I don't know if I would do that again. I'm going to have to find another way if I were to use leaf hops to put it in the boil here. Maybe have it hang or I don't know what, but it also floated a lot too. When you put in pellet hops, it tends to kind of dissolve and sink in. This I had to kind of keep pushing it down into the boil. But it smells great. Looks really good, smells great. I have to add Irish moss at 5 minutes left, and I'm not quite there yet, but I'm going to add that in 5 minutes. I'm not going to video that because you're just going to see me throw this in there, and well, that's not very exciting. So what I'm going to do now is the next segment is going to be where I'm going to chill the wort here. That's the kind of the final phase before you pitch your yeast. So after this is finished, I will rapidly cool this down using a wort chiller, bring the temperature down to about mid-70s. That's a good enough temperature range to throw the yeast in, or pitch the yeast as they say. If it's any higher than that, you could potentially kill off the yeast. So you don't want to do that because that's what eats the sugars and creates your alcohol. So it's looking great, it's dark, it has a good hop aroma to it. It should turn out to be a pretty good beer at the end of it all, but we'll come back when we do the chilling. Okay, so now what I'm doing is chilling my wort with a wort chiller. And all this is a coiled pipe of copper that goes down into the wort. You bring in cold water, and then the heat from the wort transfers into the pipe, and it heats up the water coming out, so it kind of draws out the heat. So what I'm doing now is cooling this down as quickly as I can to about 70 degrees, where it's safe to pitch the yeast. So it sometimes helps actually while doing this, if you can kind of move the coil up and down to kind of help circulate the water around in there. Kind of helps a little bit in lowering the temperature. Just make sure you don't touch the hot side of the coil as it comes out, because you'll scald yourself, because that's some hot water. It's about 200 degrees right now. So I'm gonna let this cool down, and then we'll get to the final stage. This is where we're gonna pitch the yeast at the very end, and then that'll conclude at least the brewing part of this entire segment. So we'll check back then. Okay, so for those of you that are more into the numbers of efficiency and original gravity and final gravity, this is the time that you want to take some of those numbers down and jot them down on your recipe. So what I did here is, after I chilled my wort down to about 75 degrees, I took my cylinder here that I had with my brew kit that I got many years ago, and it comes with it a hydrometer. And the hydrometer weighs or gives the specific gravity of the solution that you put it in. So according to the recipe here, I should be at 1.06, and what my reading here is 1.054. So it's a little bit lower than what's stated on this recipe here, but that's okay. So what's going to happen is once I put the wort into here, the cooled wort in here, the yeast is going to eat the sugars, and that's going to drop the gravity of the solution. And then what you can do is take a reading at the very end, run it through an equation, and it will tell you what your alcohol volume will be. So just thought I'd let you know in case that's what you want to do. I'm going to jot this in my notes so I have an idea as to how well my boil performed. So what we're going to do now is pour my cooled wort into my carboy here. One thing you want to be aware of is when you do that is you want to aerate your wort. In doing so, that helps the yeast activate a lot quicker and be more effective at consuming the sugars that are in your wort. So I'm going to do that now, and then we'll come on back for the pitching of the yeast. Well, here we are at the final stage of the brewing process. It's the pitching of the yeast. Remember now, according to the recipe, I had to use a different type of a yeast. This is a California ale yeast, White Labs WLP001. According to the directions here, you should take this out of your refrigerator, assuming of course you kept it refrigerated, 3 hours or so before you're ready to use it. So that's what I did. It tends to clump up on the bottom, so you have to give it a good shake. to kind of get it from sticking to the bottom, and you should be ready to go. So it's looking really good so far. One thing that I did notice though, when I used the leaf hops, when I poured it in here to the carboy, I had far less sediment. When I've used the pellet hops before, I didn't use a bag. I would just throw it in my boil, and when I would pour it in here, I would get a lot of sediment, and it took so long to fill this up because I had to keep cleaning out the filter over and over again. But since I used the leaf hops in the bag, it contained a lot of that I removed beforehand. And the only sediment that I did get in here was when I threw in the Irish moss for the clarifying agent. And that was really the only thing that kind of stopped up the filter. So filling this up was much easier this time, going with actually bagging or putting the hops in a strainer. So I think even if I use a pellet hops next time, I'm going to use some sort of a strainer. So you might want to think about that too. It's a time saver when you get to this stage, because doing this for all day, for many hours, it's good to kind of get things finished at the end. So anyway, here we go. So we're going to pour this in here. Try not to spill any of it. Get it all down in there. Now, after I take this out, I'm going to put an airlock on there, which is very important. This comes again with a lot of these kits. There's a little valve here that you want to put a little bit of water in, and what that's going to do is it's going to keep the air from the outside entering in, but it's going to allow the gases that are produced by the yeast as it eats the sugars to escape out. And that's important. You don't want to get any contaminants in here while it's fermenting. So this is a very effective use to do that during fermentation. Now, you can also attach a hose to the end of this instead and run the hose out and put it into a bucket that's filled with some water, and you'll notice that it will bubble as well. It kind of serves the same purpose, but if you're kind of constrained with space, this is a very effective means of protecting your fermentation process here. So the yeast is in. Cap it, there's a little bit in the cap here, and that's it. So I'm going to cap it here, and it's good to kind of give it a little swirl. Because when you pour the yeast in, it tends to kind of stick to the sides of the glass. You want to make sure you wash all that down so it gets down in here so it can start doing some good stuff. So it's capped. I'm going to put a little bit of water in here to protect it. Put it in a closet for probably about a week to 10 days, which is when the fermentation process will kind of cease. It'll probably start fermenting in about maybe 48 hours or so. Let it run for a couple days. You'll see it kind of perk up, and then it'll kind of die off. And then you could either bottle condition it or keg it, which is what I'm going to do. Or you can kind of let it sit in here for a little while. You can of course rack it to a secondary fermentator, do secondary fermentation. That might kind of make it smoother. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to stick with one here. But anyway, stick around. This is the end of the brewing part. When this is all done in a couple weeks, I'm going to come back and do a tasting for you and tell you how all the stuff that I did today has turned out. Hopefully it was a worthwhile effort. So stay tuned. So here we are 3 weeks after brewing. Primary fermentation lasted about 5 days. A few days after fermentation had stopped, I kegged the beer. I racked it straight into a keg. I didn't do any sort of secondary fermentation, which you can do, but I didn't do it this time. The starting gravity was 1.054, and remember I took that after I chilled the wort and just before I pitched my yeast. The final gravity was 1.016, and I took this just as I was kegging the beer. This gave me an ABV of about 5%. Now, the recipe stated I should have been closer to 6%, so I'm definitely on the low side on this one, but that's okay. I much prefer a beer with a good flavor to it than a lot of heavy alcohol flavor to it. So anyway, after I kegged it, I had to try it, right? As any home brewer would probably do, and it tasted pretty good. Obviously flat because it wasn't carbonated yet. but it had really good flavors to it in the very beginning. But as the weeks passed, I've tried it and it started to taste a little bit better. So now we're this far out. Let's give it a pour and see what it's going to taste now. And I expect it will taste even a little bit better. Ooh, okay. A little foamy. I think I got the keg aggravated there. Let's rate it on the 4 categories that you use to rate your beer. The first category is the appearance. This is basically judging the overall color based on the style, the clarity of the beer, and the beer head. Deep, dark, black color as you would expect in a stout. Clarity, I don't see any sort of haze or cloudiness at all. It's hard to tell though, it's pretty dark beer. And the beer head, it does linger somewhat. It's a kind of a good, thick, rich head on it. So it looks pretty good so far. I'm going to give it 4.5 stars out of 5 for the appearance category. The next category is the aroma. This is based on the actual strength and the sense that you're detecting in the beer. Definitely more maltier than hoppy, which is what I would expect. Kind of a, almost kind of like a roasted malt aroma. A decent chocolate scent. I would have expected a stronger one for this. If you're going to be called a chocolate stout, you would expect to have a pronounced chocolate scent. But it is one there. I can detect a little bit. It has a scent that it smells good. So I'm looking forward to trying this again. The next part of the judging is the palate. This is the initial taste of the beer. You don't want to take a full go, but just a little bit to see what it feels like on the tip of your tongue. So let's give it a try. Very smooth, definitely not having any sort of initial bite on my tongue. It's probably due to the hops that I've used, the amount of it that I used, and the bittering stage when I've added it into my boil there, kind of all contributing to a pretty smooth beer. As usually goes, the flavors here are going to probably mellow out over time. I imagine as this sits, it'll get smoother and smoother in the keg. Not an overly sweet malty taste. Good and roasty. It's at 5% here, so you can't really detect much of an alcohol flavor, which again I prefer for a stout. It's very easy drinking. I'm going to have to rate this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Now on to the finish. This is based on the final taste of the beer, so you want to get a good mouth full of it, kind of aerate it as you bring it in, and see what the flavors come out. No bitterness at all, no aftertaste. I don't taste any chocolate really, but then again, the chocolate was added in the beginning, so I don't think I'm going to really detect it, and of course I didn't use very much of it. It's a good roasty, malty kind of a flavor, which is really good. It's a really good, it's a common flavor that you would find in a stout like this, so I'm very pleased with it. I'm going to give a 4.5 out of 5 stars for that. I think this is a really good stout. This turned out really well for my first one that I've ever made all grain. It's not heavy on the alcohol. It has a good roasty, malty flavor. Really good mouthfeel. The carbonation obviously helps with that to kind of give it a fuller flavor. No aftertaste, no bitterness at all. Since it's been sitting here, it's established a really good mouthfeel over these couple of weeks. So I expect that to improve over time. It could have been a little bit more on the chocolatey side, but this tastes better than it did about a week ago, so who knows over time if it's going to kind of bring out some more flavors that I'm not detecting now. If it even lasts that long. This is a really good easy drinking beer that you can just kick back, on a cool fall winter night and easily have a couple pints of these. This will definitely stay in my rotation for the fall and winter brewing months, which is probably one of the more favorite seasons that I like to get outside when it's cool out and brew a good batch of beer. Anyway, give it a try. I think you're going to enjoy doing this. Very satisfying beer, not hard to do as you can see. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. Happy brewing.